Hi, this is Jose Luis at Parametric Camp, and welcome to another video in this series, Advanced Development in Grasshopper. In this video, I would like to go and explain really superficially what the Grasshopper Software Development Kit is and why it's interesting for us when we're doing development in Grasshopper. You may have heard me in previous videos talk about the Rhino Common and being this library that lives inside of Rhino and that we can use to access all the power of geometry manipulations, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes things about how Rhino, the actual program, the actual software, how it runs on your system, right? So it turns out that not all functionality that we can access in Grasshopper comes from Rhino Common. Some of the functionality, specifically the one that relates to how Grasshopper works, how the solutions are updated, how the components are laid on the system, how they talk to each other, etc. All of that, Rhino Common has no idea of how it works because it's a plugin, right? So all of that functionality actually lives somewhere else and it's provided to us through what's called the Grasshopper SDK, which basically is another library, another DLL, another file with a lot of code packed inside of it, just like Rhino Common is, but that takes care specifically of giving us interfaces, giving us classes and giving us functionality that relates specifically to Grasshopper and how Grasshopper works. Okay, so and before we get into looking at documentation or anything, I would like to illustrate this with a very simple example. If you were looking at if you saw my previous video, in my previous video in this series, what we did was we created this very simple C# component that just spits out a list of numbers from a start to an endpoint. And we were using script parasite to dump to some development folder to dump here some files that that then we could use to open them in Visual Studio so that we could do development from this C# component in Visual Studio and then have access to better autocomplete, pop-ups, etc., etc. The problem was that something that I like a lot is to have my development files, so the files that script parasite generates, all of this Grasshopper Studio project, to have them next to the Grasshopper file that I am developing. And in order to do that, because I have to feed the script parasite component, I have to feed it a path. If I hardcode that path, if I just write where the file is, then that might be prone to errors and it might be prone to me moving the file around in my file system, whatever, and things not working anymore. Or the file is being saved in the previous folder, in the one that is hard-coded here. So what I would like to do is I would like to write a C# script component that always gives me the path where the current Grasshopper file is saved. So that if I move that file somewhere else, that path, when I open Grasshopper, will be updated programmatically. In order to do that, I need to write code that is aware of the Grasshopper environment. So for example, this code is living inside of a file that is saved in a particular folder, okay? And that functionality cannot be provided to me by Rhino Common because Rhino Common has no idea of Grasshopper or anything called Grasshopper being attached to it. That all functionality comes separate and it comes from the Rhino Common, the Grasshopper SDK, okay? So in order to do that, I will need to know a little bit of how Grasshopper works and look through the documentation. But what I would like to do is I would like to write that example and show you some of those classes that we're going to be using, and then go back to the documentation and take a closer look at those. So for example, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to write a component that I hope is going to generate programmatically this output. So the full path of the file where the Grasshopper definition is saved. Right now, so what I have here is, right now I have this here hard-coded, but I would like to write a C# component that does that automatically. Because this Grasshopper, this component, this script doesn't really need any input. I'm just going to remove all the inputs and I'm going to rename this here, all right? that's going to be, and then the output is also going to be called here. And what I would like is for this output to be this folder, this path. All right. The way I'm going to do that is by writing the following. First of all, I'm going to define a string variable that I'm going to call the current folder, all right, which I'm going to initialize to nothing. Okay. Then, well, and then what I'm going to do here is, first of all, I'm going to declare a variable of the type Grasshopper document. And that's going to be with an underscore in the middle. And then I'm going to call this dot. Where this is coming from and why is this, I will explain it in a second. Then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to call the owner object, and the owner object is an object that is in the scope of my C# script component that represents the Grasshopper document. And I'm going to call this function on the document, on the object that is called on ping document. When I do that, this function will return an instance of a Grasshopper document variable that I'm going to save here. And this variable will have information about the file, the document that I'm currently running inside of Grasshopper. So therefore, from this object, dot, I will be able to do things that relate to the document. So for example, you can see that I can add objects, I can find what are the active objects, who is the author, what are the attributes, I can figure out the context, I can subscribe to events, what is the display name, the ID of it. There's a lot of stuff that I can get from here. So one thing that I would like to get is the file path. So I'm going to type here file path, which you can see it's a string. So what I'm going to do is, because it's a property, so I'm going to save this string. Path is going to be all of this. So file path, all right. And then just for the sake, I'm just going to output here through the output. This is going to be equal to file path. If I do that, then you can see that what I'm getting out of the component is the full-fledged file path. So all the folders, all the structure, etc., including the name of the actual file. And if I were to save this file somewhere else, so for example, I'm going to save this to my desktop, all right? And then if I were to now update this, because I saved to my desktop, this didn't update because Grasshopper doesn't update when I save files. So what I can do is I can recompute my solution, and you can see that the file now is on my desktop. Okay. So this is very nice because if I were to open this file somewhere else, then this will update programmatically. So I'm going to save the file back where it was, or I'm just going to close it and load the file from where I had it before. Okay. So that's the file that I just downloaded. I loaded from the actual folder. The problem is that I want only the folder. I just want the path. I don't really want the file as part of the path. So what I could do is I could just do some string manipulation and make sure that I split this whole thing by the backslashes. I remove the last part and then I put everything together again, but that's not very clean. And something that I can do is that I can use the system path object to take a file path and just retrieve some information from that file path. So what I can do is I can bring in here using system.io, and IO is the namespace in C# that contains all the functionality that is useful to interface with your file system. Reading files, saving files, figuring out what is the character that separates folder names, etc., which is not the same in every system, right? And what I could do here is I can say path only is going to be equal to path, and which is an object that comes from system.io that gives me access to functionality for the system, dot, and then you can see that I have a lot of things: get full path, file extension, combine, etc., etc. It's an object that specifically is designed to work with paths and to modify them, improve them, find data from paths, etc. So what I can do is from here, I can get the directory name of a particular full path. So that's going to be file path. And if I now output file path only, all right, you can see that I just regenerated this, but this has not updated. So I'm going to recompute here. And you can see that this is not working. Let me recompute again. And we can see that this is not working for some reason. So let me take a look at why it's not working. Okay, that was just an error because for some reason this code had not properly saved inside of C# script. So I just had to open it up, write the same thing again, and now it works. Sorry for that. I don't know what happened. So you can see that now I have just the file path, all right, not the full thing. And if I go now to the folder where my Grasshopper file lives, this one here, you can see that as soon as I plug in this new folder here, all these script parasite files are going to show up here. And then if I were to now, for example, I'm going to remove all of this. And if I were to save the file to a different folder, for example, let's say I save the file in my development folder, the one that I had here. All right, you can see that I have it here. I'm going to close the file. And then as soon as I open the file again, let me open the development folder. As soon as I open the file again, the exact same one, you can see that this picked up the folder in which it was, it plugged it in here, and then all the script parasite files showed up, all right? Which now makes the whole thing much tighter, much more programmatic. It satisfies my OCD. I'm really happy about this. Okay. Now the question is, what the hell is this Grasshopper document thing? What is this property file path? Where is this coming from? Where? So let's take a look at the Grasshopper SDK. All of those things we can learn from the documentation. This is very similar to the Rhino Common documentation. What you can see is that the Grasshopper API or the SDK, they're basically the same thing. What it does is that it has a bunch of files that are like tutorials, development, examples, things that you can do with the Grasshopper SDK. And then it has the namespaces. Basically, the Grasshopper SDK has two main namespaces, Grasshopper IO, which is for reading and writing files, and the actual Grasshopper file, Grasshopper Kernel. And you can see that actually, when we're living in Grasshopper, you can see that every Grasshopper component already implements the Grasshopper, Grasshopper Kernel, Grasshopper Data, and Grasshopper Types, all these namespaces, Grasshopper, Grasshopper Kernel, Grasshopper Data, and Grasshopper Types. And why is this important? Because that gives the component access to Grasshopper functionality. So for example, if I go to Grasshopper Kernel, you can see that there's a lot of stuff, the Grasshopper Active Object, the alias, the author, and there's this thing called the Grasshopper Component. The Grasshopper Component, it's a representation of the component that the code that we're writing lives in. So for example, this has access to an icon, a description, it has access to attributes, the category that this is living, so we can know if we write code which category that component lives in, for example. We can have access to that. We can have access to the instance global unique identifier. I will talk about why that's important very soon in some examples. And then I have a bunch of functions. So for example, we're already familiar with the add runtime message. If you remember in the previous videos when we were doing error check-ins, etc., we use this function a lot to display messages on the component. And you can see that the documentation tells us that it needs the level and it needs a text, an error. And the mess and the level is also part of the Grasshopper kernel. So you can go to Grasshopper kernel.enumerators and you can find runtime message level. Okay. So for example, when I am in a component and I write here this dot component is actually a reference to the Grasshopper document, to the Grasshopper component that I'm in. And that's why I have access to add runtime message and then Grasshopper runtime message level dot, for example, remark testing the Grasshopper SDK. Okay. And if I run this code now, I will get a bubble here testing the Grasshopper SDK. Okay. So, so that's great. But where is this component coming from? Well, if you expand the Grasshopper script instance and you look at the members, you can see that the component itself has this thing called the IGH component as a variable. So what basically that means is that the Grasshopper script component contains this object called component that we can use to access the component and the properties of the component itself, or to add behavior to the component itself. So for example, by using this variable that lives in the Grasshopper script component, we can add runtime messages and get bubbles, etc., etc. Wait, so what about Grasshopper document? What is this GH document? Well, the exact same thing. If we go to the Grasshopper kernel and we look at Grasshopper document, what we can see is that we get represents the instance of a single Grasshopper document. What that means is that gives us access to the Grasshopper document itself. So for example, if I can say Grasshopper document is going to be equal to that one, Grasshopper document, the instance in this component. I can use this or I can just not use it. And then here from doc, for example, I will be able to get, for example, doc dot, and I don't know why it's not auto-completing. So let me just use this directly. This dot Grasshopper component dot, for example, get active objects. All right. So for example, I can get the list of active objects, and then because it's a list, I can do count. So for example, can I print to the console how many active objects are in this whole document? And if I do that, then you can see that it tells me that there are 10 active objects here. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I guess, for example, right? So Grasshopper document is basically a link to the Grasshopper document that owns the component that we're writing our code in. And we can see now that there's a lot of stuff. We can find the author. We can see whether if we're rendering custom elements. We can see how many objects are in the document. We can access the profiler and get document about that. Solution state, change things. We can move objects around. We can autosave. We can calculate the bounding box of some things. I don't even know what this is. There's a lot of stuff that I don't know here because I haven't really written a lot of code that modifies Grasshopper or takes, but I guess so yeah, but this is quite interesting. And actually, if you want to write components that mess up with the document and with other components and etc., this is definitely the place to start in order to learn about how to do meta manipulation of Grasshopper. Okay, beautiful. So with that, I would like to wrap it up here for this video. This was a quick introduction to the Grasshopper API, or the Grasshopper Software Development Kit, or in other words, the library that contains all the methods and all the classes that give us access to information about the document and the component that we are working with, or access to manipulating that information. And actually, in the next video, in this series, the next hands-on video, what I would like to do is I would like to write a few components for our parametric camp library, plugin, whatever, I would like to write a few components that give us information about the state of the execution, the state of the document, etc., etc. So we're going to do a few hands-on examples on the next video. Until then, if you liked what you saw or if you found it helpful, maybe like this video, subscribe to the channel, say hi, join Discord, share on Instagram, or not, or just keep watching the videos. Absolutely fine too. Thank you very much and see you on the next video. Bye.